Back in the good old days, diesel engines supplied clean, filtered, cool air to the intake manifold for combustion. But back in the early 2000s, at the same time 50 Cent's masterpiece Into Club came out, strict emissions controls came into law designed to minimize nitrogen oxide coming out of the exhaust. This resulted in the widespread adoption of exhaust gas recirculation in diesel engines. Now, the engine intentionally feeds some of that exhaust gas right back into the intake. Yes, that same exhaust gas the diesel just worked hard to get out of the cylinder, it turns around and sends it right back into the intake. Kind of sounds like a terrible idea, right? Well, in a way, yes, and in a way, no. Because modern diesel engines wouldn't pass emissions without the system, and in some cases, they wouldn't even run properly. Today's video, we're breaking down the EGR system, what it actually does, why it exists, and how it works step by step. You're going to learn what goes wrong when it fails. And trust me, if you've ever dealt with rough idles, loss of power, or plugged intakes, this is one system you're going to need to understand. Now, EGR stands for exhaust gas recirculation. And at its core, it does one simple thing. It takes a portion of that exhaust gas and routes it back into the intake system. But why would we dilute clean, filtered, boosted, fresh air with dirty exhaust? The answer is all about temperature. Because diesel engines run hot, very hot, right? And when combustion temperatures get high enough, nitrogen in the air reacts with that oxygen to form NOx emissions, or nitrogen oxides. Now, these NOx emissions are major pollutants. They contribute to smog, acid rain, and they can cause respiratory issues in humans as well. So the EGR system is designed to reduce those NOx emissions being released into the air. And since these emissions happen when combustion temperatures get too high, the EGR system lowers them by introducing that inert exhaust gas. The exhaust gas doesn't burn again, it just simply takes up space. Now, this results in less oxygen in the cylinder, which causes a slower combustion, along with lower peak temperature and therefore less NOx. So let's walk through the system, starting with the airflow through an engine. You've got that fresh filtered air coming through the intake. The air mixes with fuel in the cylinder and it combusts. And after combustion, there's exhaust gas, which is going to leave through the exhaust manifold. And now the EGR system, it creates a bridge between these two systems. Exhaust gas leaves the cylinder and heads out of the exhaust manifold. A portion of that is diverted before it hits the turbo in many systems. Now, this exhaust passes through an EGR cooler, then through an EGR valve, and then back into the intake manifold to mix with that clean, filtered intake air. Let's break down these components a little more, starting with the EGR valve, because this is the gatekeeper. It controls how much exhaust is allowed back into the intake. In modern diesels, it'll almost certainly be electronically controlled, and it constantly adjusts based on engine load, temperature, and RPM. Under light throttle, more EGR is introduced back in. With a heavy load, less EGR, or maybe even none, is going to be put back into the intake. Next, we have the EGR cooler. Hot exhaust gas coming out of the cylinder and exhaust manifold can be over 500 degrees Celsius, or 930 Fahrenheit, somewhere in that range. If that gets dumped straight into the intake, you're going to lose power, the intake temps are going to increase, and efficiency is going to suffer. So the cooler drops that temperature significantly, using that engine coolant to absorb some of that heat from the exhaust and get it out of there. Then there are sensors and ECM control, because the engine computer is closely watching intake temperature, the engine load, the throttle position, and the NOx levels on newer systems. And it's going to use all of this information and adjust the EGR flow in real time. So when is EGR active? Well, EGR is not always on. In fact, it's usually active under light load, cruising speeds, and is typically off during cold starts, wide open throttle, and heavy towing. Why is that? Well, because when you need power, you want maximum oxygen. And EGR reduces that oxygen so it gets shut off. When the engine is cold, you want as much heat in the cylinder as you can to get the engine started. Sounds like an amazing system, right? Now, while EGR does work great for reducing NOx emissions, it comes with some serious trade-offs, starting with carbon buildup. Now, since we're mixing soot from the exhaust with oil vapor from crankcase ventilation, this results in a thick carbon sludge produced as a byproduct. And over time, this builds up in things like intake manifolds, EGR valves, and intake ports. Intakes can get so clogged up with this buildup that airflow can be significantly reduced. And this restricted airflow can result in reduced power, poor fuel economy, and sluggish throttle response. And then we have the problem I've seen a lot, and that's sticking EGR valves. When carbon builds up, the valve can stick open, resulting in a rough idle and low power issues. In cold winter temps, codes often come active for EGR valve unable to achieve a commanded position. This is a fancy way of saying the EGR valve is simply frozen. If the EGR valve sticks closed, increased NOx occurs and engine codes can result. And what about problems with those EGR coolers? Well, EGR coolers can crack internally and leak coolant into the intake or simply clog up with too much of that carbon sludge. This can lead to white smoke, coolant loss, and engine damage. On diesel engines that have EGR coolers, you may see that the coolant system needs to be bled very properly so that you don't have any air bubbles getting into the EGR cooler system. Those air bubbles are in there, they can superheat, which can blow up inside of your EGR cooler, resulting in leaking coolant and a failed system. So what are some common systems of EGR problems you're going to likely run into? Well, as we mentioned before, we're going to have rough idle, loss of power, increased fuel consumption, and black smoke, along with check engine lights. Now, common codes include EGR flow insufficient, EGR flow excessive, EGR valve unable to achieve commanded position, as in the frozen EGR valve code, and sometimes no codes at all, just poor performance. Let's get into something a little bit controversial. Let's get into something a little bit more controversial. Something that's also illegal in many places, and that's deleting the EGR system. Now, some people remove EGR systems to increase power, reduce carbon buildup, and improve reliability. And yes, it can do those things. But it also increases emissions, and that's illegal in many areas. Now, there are stories about shops and mechanics getting fined for performing these EGR deletes as well. Proceed with caution and do your research if that's something that you're thinking about. So as a new technician, you need to understand the system, whether it's there or not. And at the end of the day, the EGR system is one of those things that makes modern diesels cleaner, but also a bit more complex. If you can understand how it works, when it operates, and how it fails, you'll be in good shape to get things back working as they should. That EGR valve we were talking about, it has a position sensor that's supposed to make sure the valve moves when commanded by the ECM. To learn more about diesel engine sensors just like this one, watch this video next.